ever noticed that storytelling tropes are both adored and reviled by media enthusiasts worldwide? Even though tropes are a storyteller's secret recipe behind crafting unforgettable stories, they're also behind some of storytelling's biggest flops. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to be speed ranking 20 tropes from top to flop and everything in between. Why 20? Where did that number come from? Well, we're celebrating a milestone on this channel, 2K subs, and I've also released chapter 2 of my manga, OLDE Treehouse, so that's a lot of twos. I'm Sam, aka Fifi Mangaka, and whether you're an aspiring writer, comic creator, or you just love a good story, paying attention to tropes will change the way you understand storytelling. So let's start with our first trope, It Was All a Dream. It Was All a Dream trope involves revealing that the events of a story, or a significant part of it, were all part of a dream of one of the characters, which negates a significant, if not all, of the entire story. For this one, I'm labeling it a flop. My problem with It Was All a Dream is simply put, everything that you've seen transpire up until that point becomes completely null and void and chalked up to the character was just sleeping. The issue with this is I feel like sometimes authors can go really crazy with the dream aspect, and there's really no boundaries because anything that happens during the course of a story can just be chalked up to one crazy, weird dream. So I'm gonna put this one under flop, not because I think it's bad. I don't think there are any bad tropes. I just think there's bad execution, and this is one that I think is executed more poorly than it's executed well. The Chosen One. The Chosen One is a character who's singled out by fate or prophecy to accomplish a significant and often world-saving task. Think Harry Potter. He's the best example of the Chosen One that I can think of. This trope gets a meh from me. The reason why I kind of dislike the Chosen One trope is because they can conquer and overcome anything, and the explanation for that is because they are the Chosen One. It doesn't matter what their life was like before they found out that they were the Chosen One. Every obstacle kind of parts ways in their path so that they can achieve whatever the aims are. And that to me kind of reduces tension and significant impact of other characters in the story. I also think this trope tends to lend itself to lazy writing just because everything can be chalked up to, well, this kid is the one who's supposed to do the thing that we're saying that they do. So Chosen One gets a meh. The Femme Fatale. Femme Fatale is a mysterious and seductive woman whose charms ensnare her lovers, often leading them into compromising, dangerous, and deadly situations. Faye Valentine from Cowboy Bebop is one of the most iconic Femme Fatale characters, and believe it or not, I actually really love this trope, and I think it's top. The reason is I feel like characters who fall into the Femme Fatale trope tend to be more fleshed out than strong female lead characters. They're more complex, and they typically have a reason for why they fall down this femme fatale rabbit hole. Of course, there are instances where the character is basically just surmounts to an overly sexualized female character, but in a lot of the examples that I've seen, femme fatales are complex, they kick ass, and they're a lot more interesting than some of the other archetypes and tropes you might see being used for female characters. So the classic femme fatale gets a top from me. The ensemble cast, and you may be surprised that this one gets a meh from me, considering I have an ensemble cast in my own comic. The ensemble cast is a narrative that focuses on a group of characters rather than a single protagonist, with each character having their own arcs and their own development. And the reason why this one gets a meh for me is because I feel like the over amount of characters with the ensemble cast automatically relegates one or two of the characters in that cast to the background. So basically, they'll just become stand-ins or placeholders for typical tropes, and they won't really be fleshed out. One Piece kind of suffers from this a little bit because Straw Hats that are added later in the story, you might find you have less connection with them, like Brook, or maybe even Jimbei now that he's officially a Straw Hat. So I think the ensemble cast can be done really well, but it's when you keep that cast at a bite-sized and sensible amount that I think it could be good. So it's a meh for me just because it could go either way. The Damsel in Distress. A female character who is placed in a dangerous situation and often requires rescue by the hero, often criticized for its passive portrayal of women. And as you know, if you've watched any video on this channel, you know I'm putting this one as a flop. I absolutely detest the damsel in distress trope because it's based off of a lot of antiquated and false beliefs about women and what they're capable of and needing saving, etc. Usually when writers use this trope, they fail to really flesh out a good narrative arc for the female character, so her entire existence just depends on being saved by a hero. And, you know, I don't really like that. I think that was probably fine back in the 1930s when certain movies were made. And, you know, Princess Peach is an iconic character, so we can forgive her for that. But typically, I don't really like to see this one in media, so it's gonna get a flop from me. The anti-hero. A protagonist who lacks traditional heroic qualities such as morality and idealism, but still performs heroic deeds. One word, Guts from Berserk. He perfectly embodies this trope of the anti-hero. One thing I love about this trope is the fact that this character may seem broody, they may seem tough, they may seem rough on the outside, they may somewhat have questionable means to achieving heroic aims, but ultimately they still fall under that moral bracket. They just have a little more seasoning or spice to them, if you will. So for me, anti-hero is absolutely a top because it hinges on subversion, which I think is one of the most effective tools you can use in storytelling. Subversive characters are oftentimes the most liked characters because they tend to have that very human, contrasting outward look and feeling. So I think the anti-hero typically makes for a great character, and this trope is a top. The tragic backstory. A character has a sorrowful or traumatic past that shapes their motivations and actions in the story. Basically, every anime and manga character ever. This one gets a meh for me. I don't think the tragic backstory is 100% terrible, but I also don't think it's really good either. Again, I think this is one of those tropes that allows the author to kind of excuse away certain things or not have to explain a character's upbringing or maybe even justify some of that character's actions with, well, things were bad for them in the beginning of their life, so that's why they're able to do this thing. It also sometimes is used to kind of pull at heartstrings of the audience without necessarily earning that through the experiences of the character in the story. So I find that it's usually really contrived. That's not to say there aren't good usages of the tragic backstory, but when it's overused, as in every character has it, it becomes a little bit of a bust for me. So meh on tragic backstory. The anti-villain. A villain with noble goals, personality traits, or sympathetic qualities that make them more complex and relatable. An example of this would be Magneto from X-Men. He often has motives that are sympathetic to mutants specifically, despite his antagonistic methods. So I love the anti-villain. It's another trope that relies very heavily on subversion, which again, I think is one of the most effective tools you could use in writing, is to subvert the audience's expectation. The anti-villains most of the time become some of the most beloved characters because we can relate to that imperfection that they tend to have. A lot of times we can also relate to how they want to achieve certain means, and they, you know, may have a tragic backstory like the previous trope, but they use it to explore other possibilities of whatever is moral in the world that they exist in. This one is a top trope for me, and I absolutely love when I see this executed in anything. It's typically done pretty well, I think. The ego, the superego, and the id. Based on a psychological framework derived from Freud's theory representing different aspects of a person's psyche, the instinctual desires, the rational mind, and the moral conscious. So think Powerpuff Girls, Final Fantasy X2, Totally Spies. A lot of media from the early 2000s and late 90s use this trope a lot. I love this trope. This is top. This is probably one of my favorite tropes because it allows you to explore contrasting personalities. And when they're put in a trio, which is how the trope works, you can see those personalities bouncing off of each other and playing off of each other really nicely. And that makes for some great character dynamics and character arcs. I actually used this trope in my own story for three of my main characters, and I just think it's so super effective. I also was very partial to the color coding that happened with this trope in the early 2000s, so I might be a little bit biased, but the superego, the id, and the ego are a top trope for me. The chivalrous pervert. A character, often male, who displays both chivalrous and perverted behavior, frequently causing comedic or problematic situations. This one can get old pretty quickly if the character doesn't grow out of it at some point. Sanji from One Piece is the best example I could give of the chivalrous perv trope. He's a gentleman to women, but he's also prone to like the nosebleeds and like the overexcitement and just like the general nonsensical reactions. And I feel like a lot of people were frustrated with his character because he doesn't break out of that. He's not not really serious to the level that Zoro, for example, is, which makes for a good dichotomy between the two of those characters. But on his own, it can get a little dry and it can get a little bit irritating. I'm going to give this one a meh. I think it could be funny at first, but if you're writing using this trope, I think it's best to have this character grow out of this gag eventually, or at least not have them reacting so strongly every single time they're on the screen. The love triangle. I'm prepared to rustle some feathers with this one. A romantic plot involving 3 characters where the protagonist must choose between 2 potential love interests. Twilight is an example, I will just say an example, not good or bad, of the love triangle. I'm going to give the love triangle a flop. And the reason why I think it's a flop, of course, I could go on a massive diatribe about the implications of how we portray one side versus the other and why the character goes for one side over the other. But simply put, the character that I want to win in the triangle never wins. And I think that's why I think this trope is a flop trope. You will never please anyone with it. There's always going to be one side, one faction that's upset with how things turn out. And in this case, for me, it's typically me. I'm going to think of Food Wars when I'm considering that. I was very unhappy with how the romantic interests in Food Wars wound up. So love triangle for me is a flop. Dead parents. A common backstory element where characters' parents are deceased, often serving as motivation for the character's actions. Similarly for me to how the tragic backstory is, I'm really not a big fan of the dead parents trope. I think it's another kind of lame and overused excuse to make the audience have some sort of emotional connection to the main character, particularly if it's revealed very suddenly at the beginning of the story. I feel like it has even less impact because I barely know this character at this stage. To me, the dead parents trope is a flop. Anime and manga love to use this trope, and I think it loses its effectiveness every single time that I see it. It's okay to have characters that do come from a good family background. There are ways that you can make them interesting and emotional without like always killing their parents. So dead parents is a flop. I'm kind of tired of seeing it, to be honest with you. The call to adventure. An event or series of events that propel the protagonist from their ordinary world into their adventure. I love this trope. I think a lot of good stories are based off of this call to adventure, particularly fantasy stories. This one is a top for me. The reason why I think it's compelling in fantasy is because certain stories, the main character comes from a very ordinary place and time, a very ordinary location in the world. And once they get that call to adventure, they kind of leave all of that behind and move into this like fantastical world. And I think when you're watching a movie, reading a manga, or reading a book, it could feel almost like you're going on that journey with them, leaving the mundane, leaving, your world behind as the audience member and going into that new world with the protagonist. So I think Call to Adventure just feels like a great start to a story. It always makes me feel good when I'm reading something and I feel that call to adventure. So this trope is top for me. Ex Big Bad. A former major antagonist becomes an ally or less significant threat in the story, often after being defeated or having a change of heart. There's only one character that came to my mind with this trope, and that's Dr. Eggman from Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. And basically, anytime you see him, he's originally the big bad that the crew has to fight, and then he does something terrible and needs Sonic's help at the end. This one is a meh for me, and it really depends on how terrible the thing that the villain initially did was. In the case of Eggman, particularly in Sonic Adventure 1, he steals all the Chaos Emeralds from all the protagonists. He gives them to Chaos, who then turns into this super dangerous and massive perfect form. And then, after he messes everything up, he goes back to Sonic and asks for his help to defeat Chaos. It's just frustrating. I love Sonic, but I hate this trope so much, and I only tolerate it because I love Sonic. So this one is a meh for me. The strong female lead character. A female character designed to be strong that often lacks depth, being defined solely by her physical prowess or independence rather than her complexity as a character. You already know, if you've been on this channel for a while, I think this trope is a complete flop. I don't like to see it. It doesn't mean what some authors think it means. It doesn't mean you're creating an actually strong female character. It means you're distilling down her emotional and narrative arc to, I'm strong, I don't need any help, and maybe even she doesn't show emotion, or maybe she's, just not friendly to her team. Every time I see this trope, it kind of makes me upset. There are ways to write powerful female characters without distilling them to kind of these very shallow parts, plain and simple. This one is probably, if I could rank the floppiest flop, this would be at the top of my flop list. I really don't like the strong female lead trope. So yes, the floppiest flop goes to this one. The interrupted confession. The interrupted confession is basically when two characters are going to confess that they love each other or some such romantic thing like that. It's interrupted somehow. Doesn't matter what it is, but it's just interrupted. So as someone who used to be a romance author who has published over 5 romance novels, this is probably one of the worst things you could do when you're dealing with romantic subplots. So I'm going to put this as a flop. It doesn't build the romantic angst that some authors think that it does. It's just irritating. Romance has very specific beats that you have to hit in order to get that satisfaction from romance readers. And it usually winds up in a payoff. And by nature, the interrupted confession interrupts the very payoff of the romantic subplot. So this one is like, not only is it a flop, but it's like a massive no-no. If you want a lot of angry romance readers, use an interrupted confession and then let me know how it goes for you. Flop, flop, flop. Lamp shading. This one is a little complex. It's the technique of drawing attention to a plot hole or implausible event within the story by having a character acknowledge it, and it's most often done in a humorous manner. You can think of it kind of like breaking the fourth wall. I think that lamp shading gets a meh for me because I feel like it works well in comedy if the comedic joke lands, but if it doesn't, you've risked a complete tonal shift in your story that could be perceived as too jokey or too meta, and it could also cause your audience to focus on small flaws within your story that they otherwise wouldn't even pay attention to. So I think the reason why lamp shading is a meh for me is because I feel like it's very risky unless your story has this overall lighthearted and comedic tone. Kind of like the scene you're seeing right now between Krillin and the bacterium when Goku tells Krillin, "You don't have a nose. Why are you getting affected by this guy so much?" That's a good example of lamp shading, but I still feel it's too risky, so meh. The hero's journey. A narrative template involving a hero who goes on an adventure, who faces and overcomes crises, and returns transformed. This one is top for me. I think the hero's journey is kind of woven into almost every great story that exists in some fashion. It may not be the typical style of hero's journey, but this idea of embarking on some sort of journey and coming back changed is a very big premise to most stories. I love this trope, and I think that there's no harm in using it as the basis and the foundation for your story. It can only guide you in a great way. Hero's journey is a tried and true trope for me. It's top. It's probably one of the top on my list. This one leaves the reader feeling completely satisfied, and you feel like you go on the journey with the characters, and that's why I think this one is so incredibly effective. So maybe when you're thinking of how to start your next story, I think you should consider starting at the hero's journey. The mentor. The mentor is a character who provides guidance and training to the protagonist, often imparting their wisdom and skills necessary for the hero's journey. This one for me is top. I absolutely love the mentor trope because especially when you're using younger protagonists, it helps to have that older, more wise character to kind of guide them along and also break up a little bit of the ridiculousness that young characters tend to have. The mentor character with this trope oftentimes dies, but of course you can subvert that all you'd like, and it still creates a very impactful and often beloved character. Some examples would be Shanks from One Piece, Mihawk from One Piece. These are characters that kind of have this elusive, knowledgeable or strong, been there, done that kind of vibe to them. So I really enjoy seeing these characters in mediums and think that oftentimes they tend to be some of the more popular characters within the fandoms that they're in. Memory loss. A character loses their memory, leading to a quest for identity or recovery of lost knowledge, often seen as a cliched plot device. Sabo from One Piece lost his memory after having his ship destroyed by a world noble. He forgot all about Luffy and Ace up until Ace's death. This conveniently explains away why he was nowhere to be found in early One Piece, but is now suddenly dedicated to his brother, Luffy. I really do not like memory loss because I feel like it is a crutch that storytellers use when they want to inject something that doesn't make any sense otherwise, or they kind of want to explain away certain things. And usually tropes that you use as a crutch like that, I'm not a fan of them because readers can smell that from a mile away. Memory loss can be done well. If you're curious about some ways I think it's done well, you can look into Rave Master. The character Ellie has a really good execution of memory loss, but otherwise I think memory loss is a flop trope. And that's it. We got through 20 tropes in 20 minutes, and I gave you my opinions on them. I don't think any trope is particularly bad inherently. I think there are just bad executions of tropes. So of course, this is all just my opinion. You may agree or disagree. Like, sound off in the comments and let me know what you think. I know some of my opinions can be a little weird, but I'm pretty sure some of you agree with a lot of it. Thank you so much for supporting the Fifi Mangaka channel. My goal is to help everyone tell the great stories that we're all capable of telling and just write stories that make people feel. So the fact that we've gotten this channel up to 2K subs is like beyond exciting. If you want to see how I use some of the tropes that we talked about on this list, you can check out my manga Yield Treehouse. It's available exclusively on Global Comics, and I just dropped chapter 2 today. So go check it out. The link is in the description down below, and let me know what you think about it, and also let me know if you find any of the tropes that I used in chapter 1 and 2. And as always, I'll see you next time. Bye.